Welcome to this episode of Paranormal AF, the podcast where we spill the tea on all things paranormal. I'm your host, Rin. In this episode, we are going to talk about the Ouija board. The actual body of this episode was recorded a while ago for my first podcast, but I felt it would be a really good fit for Paranormal AF as well as important information to share, and that's why I've decided to dust it off and re-upload it here. So, if you notice a difference in the audio, it's because the body of this episode was recorded with a different microphone and at a different place and time. I have edited the original audio a bit to improve quality, and I'm going to have some additional commentary after the original audio, so be sure to stick around for that. We're getting close to October, which is prime divination time, and even those who don't normally practice divination or some form of spirit communication sometimes get the bug in the month of October to try a method or two. Since the Ouija board doesn't require you to memorize rules or meanings or any particular system for its use, many times it seems like the most accessible tool to the novice for these forays into spirit communication. There's a lot of misinformation out there about Ouija boards or spirit boards or talking boards, as they are sometimes called. I'll try to put some of those myths to rest in this episode, but I also know that, quite frankly, this episode is going to piss some people off. There are those that no matter what evidence you present them with, are going to stay steadfast to their convictions that the Ouija board and spirit boards, talking boards, and the like are objects of pure demon summoning evil. And if you've followed me for any length of time, you may already know my feelings on the D word. That aside, I have seen some truly ignorant and hateful things said in paranormal and pagan groups when the topic of Ouija boards is brought up. I'm not here to try to change anyone's spiritual beliefs, and it's not my place, and some of what I will talk about is experiential, and I acknowledge that we do not all have the same experiences, and I'm not trying to invalidate anyone else's experiences. I'm merely proposing that when we take the facts about Ouija boards into consideration, that we then look at those experiences from a certain perspective. If you are the type of person that believes Ouija boards are truly evil and nothing can sway you from that belief, then I recommend checking out one of my other podcast episodes. But if you're on the fence or open to the concept of Ouija boards in general, then this episode should be right up your alley. If you're also on the other extreme, that you believe that they are absolutely magical and mystical, and that they are imbued with any sort of magic in and of themselves, spoiler alert, this episode is going to cover how that's not the case. So if you are determined to keep a certain perspective of the Ouija board where it is magical, then this also might not be an episode for you, because we're going to be talking about documented facts and scientific studies. So just want to give anybody, if you don't want to hear anything that might be controversial to you about your ideas on the Ouija board, go check out another episode and we'll catch you next week. But if you are on the fence or you're just completely open-minded about it, then keep listening. Ouija boards, just like tarot cards, pendulums, other cartomancy decks, and all the tools of the like, are neither good nor evil in and of themselves. They are merely inanimate objects that do not possess any magic in and of themselves. Only after we deem them as something and imbue them with that energy and purpose do they have a leaning one way or the other. And even if we assign them a leaning one way or the other, that energy is mutable. A Ouija board is nothing more than a piece of mass-produced cardboard, if you're buying the Hasbro one. A Ouija board from Hasbro is no more intrinsically evil than Hasbro's Clue board game. It's made in the same type of factory with the same type of material. No surprise here, we do not know the complete history of the Ouija board, which for many is part of its appeal. I've read so many unsubstantiated accounts of who really invented it and when. So instead of stoking those gossip fires, we're going to talk about what facts we can trace through documentation. There really is no evidence of talking boards, spirit boards, or Ouija boards, whichever name you prefer to use, being used as any sort of ancient spirit communication tool. When we see them enter into human history is during the 19th century and the spiritualist movement here in America. The timeline I will give you is supported by newspaper articles, patent office correspondences, patent files, records of business licenses, and some of these documents also match the stories told by the descendants of the folks we're going to talk about. I found much of my information through the Smithsonian, but the original company who patented the Ouija board also has a website that details some of the board's history. There's some information on their website that doesn't jive with what I found through the Smithsonian, but they had documentation to support their info, and honestly, it answers some of the questions I had after reading through the Smithsonian info. So any way you slice it, this isn't tabloid gossip here. We're talking about people and events that are supported through some form of documentation. Who actually invented the first talking board, spirit board? We may likely never know, and it may have been the work of more than one person. The spiritualist movement hit America in the mid-19th century and thrived here. But the methods of communicating with spirits at that time involved things like knocking, which were time consuming, and frankly our ancestors would sometimes get bored with the process. During a seance, the person leading it would say the alphabet out loud, and everyone would listen for a knock to indicate the letters to spell out the message from the spirit. Honestly, I don't think I could have sat through one of these. Now, there were other means of spirit communication during this time, but folks wanted a faster, more streamlined way to communicate with spirits, one that even someone who wasn't a medium could use. In fact, some spiritualist mediums weren't the Ouija board's biggest fans because it was a form of competition. In 1886, we see a talking board pop up in the Ohio spiritualist circles, and it starts to become very popular. I can't find a name attributed to this board, just references to it being used. This board featured letters and numbers with a planchette that allowed for easier spirit communication. A man from Baltimore, Maryland, by the name of Charles Kennard, saw a business opportunity in these talking boards and rounded up 4 investors. 2 of them were Elijah Bond, a patent attorney, and Colonel Washington Bowie, a surveyor, according to what I found through the Smithsonian. It bothered me that the Smithsonian material didn't list the names of the 2 other men, so I did some digging and discovered the following information. According to the company's official company biography website, which uses incorporation documents and patent documents to support its timeline, Bond was not one of the initial men involved in ownership of the company, but was their patent attorney. On October 20th, 1890, the Kennard Novelty Company was incorporated by the following men: Harry Wells Rusk, William H.A. Maupin, John F. Green, Colonel Washington Bowie, and Charles Kennard. Despite the company being named after Kennard, he did not run the company, but he was the general manager. Kennard didn't actually contribute much capital to the venture. It was Colonel Bowie who actually contributed most of the capital. This is pure conjecture on my part, but I'd say perhaps they named the company after him because he is credited as the one who had the idea to form the company and got everyone else together, and that he contributed his failing fertilizer factory as their first Ouija board factory. Harry Wells Rusk was actually the president of the company, and Colonel Bowie was the treasurer and supervisor. I feel that it is important to mention that none of these men were, by any accounts that I have found at least, to be part of the spiritualist movement or to consider themselves spiritualists. They were just very shrewd businessmen. Bond's sister-in-law, and remember he was their patent attorney, his sister-in-law was Helen Peters Nosworthy. Now, the Smithsonian only refers to her as Helen Peters, but I have seen a picture of her headstone, and it gives her name as Helen Peters Nosworthy. She was a spiritualist medium, according to all the accounts I have found. Bond, Peters Nosworthy, and a few others were sitting around one of the boards they made, which was the Ouija board we know today, and asked the board what they should name it. Reportedly, the board spelled out Ouija. I know that you, like myself, have no doubt seen the many sources out there that say the name comes from the combining of the French word oui and the German word ja. But according to interviews from descendants and letters to the patent office, This story of the board essentially naming itself is the real story of how the board was named. They then asked the board what Ouija meant, and the board spelled out good luck. Now, there are some that say that Helen was a known fan of a writer named Ouida. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but it's Ouida. And that her brother-in-law, during this particular board naming session, the actual Ouija comes from him misspelling the name of her favorite author as he manipulated the planchette during the session. Did Bond intentionally manipulate the planchette? That is really hard to say. That's something I don't think that we'll ever be able to answer with any certainty. Her headstone credits her as the person who named the famous talking board. The group applied for a patent for their Ouija board, but in order to get the patent, they would have to prove their claims to a patent officer and convince him that the board did indeed actually work. What did they claim? Well, their claim was that the board was a link between the known and the unknown, the material and the immaterial. Bond and his sister-in-law provided a demonstration for the patent officer to prove their claims. The patent officer believed that there was no way the pair could know his correct name, and said that if the board could spell out his correct name, he would award them their patent. The Ouija board did spell out the name, which left the patent officer shaken, according to some. But true to his word, on February 10th, 1891, they were awarded their patent under the category of toy or game. Just as I lean towards believing that it was highly likely that Bond intentionally manipulated the planchette during the naming session, I lean towards theorizing that Bond had prior knowledge of the patent officer's name. I mean, he was a patent attorney, for crying out loud. I'm all for believing in spiritual things, but I didn't just fall off the turnip wagon this morning. The patent was awarded to Kennard and Maupin. I have to ask myself why it wasn't awarded to all of the men who owned the company, since this was a joint venture and neither Kennard or Maupin were the top capital contributors to the company. I have no answer for this, but as we go through the history of the company, I think we can all reasonably surmise that there must have been some dissension amongst the ranks between the men who incorporated the Kennard Novelty Company. Sales of the Ouija board were doing great, pretty much right out of the gate, but in 1891, not long at all after the business got going, Kennard and Maupin would sell their rights and interests in the company to Bond, their patent attorney. By 1892, William Fuld, who started as an employee, stockholder, and friend of Rusk and Colonel Bowie, was now running the company. While his obituary in the New York Times says that he, Fuld, was the actual inventor of the Ouija board, he never made any such claims during his life as far as I can find from any credible source. It was at this time that Bowie and Rusk restructured and renamed the company, now calling it the Ouija Novelty Company. Bowie and Rusk also dismissed the other remaining original owners at this time. Over the course of 1891 and 1892, Kennard apparently took one of the original company's factories in Chicago and used it to produce a rival talking board that he called the Volo talking board. Was he successful? I think we can say obviously not, because we don't call them Volo talking boards today. In 1898, Bowie and Rusk gave Fuld the license and exclusive rights to produce the Ouija board. The following years brought a lot of public squabbles splashed throughout newspapers, particularly in Baltimore, with different people claiming that they were the real inventor of the Ouija board. Many tried during this time to start competitor companies and boards, but each one failed. In 1919, Bowie sold his remaining shares of the company to Fuld for just $1, so that he became the full owner. I do not know when Rusk sold or relinquished his shares in the company. Sales continued to do excellent, and in 1927, Fuld died from a freak fall at one of the Ouija board factories. He fell off the roof, I do believe it was. And this was a factory that supposedly a Ouija board had told him to build. Neither the Smithsonian nor the company's biography page say if the name was changed after Fuld became the sole owner of it, nor do either of them say if the name was changed after Fuld's untimely passing. This did not deter sales of the famous board. Part of the board's success is due to the fact that it appealed to people across a wide range of socioeconomic standings. In the 1910s and 20s, we saw a real surge in the board's popularity. You have to remember that from the later 19th century until 1973, spirit communication through the use of a Ouija board wasn't considered weird or evil. It was considered normal and a family activity. It was so normal that Norman Rockwell painted an image of a man and a woman using a Ouija board, and that painting was on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post in May of 1920. You can't get much more conservative, wholesome Americana than Norman Rockwell. That's right, I just used the Ouija board and conservative in the same sentence because it was not uncommon for everyday folks to hold a seance with a Ouija board on Saturday night and go to church on Sunday morning without anyone thinking that there was anything strange or evil about it. I referenced my great-grandmother in a previous episode. She was born in 1899. She was not just a Bible thumper, but a Bible beater. I mean, this woman was a strict Christian. Yet she owned and used a Ouija board and thought nothing of it. They were not considered evil in most of her life. In 1944, just one singular New York department store sold 50,000 Ouija boards that were still being produced by Fold's Company. In 1966, Parker Brothers bought the rights to make the board from Fold's Company, and by the end of 1967, they sold 2 million boards. Ouija boards outsold their iconic game of Monopoly. Today, Hasbro owns the right to the board since they bought Parker Brothers in 1991. You may be asking yourself how we went from Saturday night seances with Ouija boards being an approved American pastime to the notion often seen today that Ouija boards are evil and channel demons. We can actually draw a straight line to one thing that changed the fabric of pop culture so significantly that it still colors how we see Ouija boards today. Prior to this singular event, there would be stories of Ouija boards in newspapers, and Ouija boards would sometimes show up in TV shows or movies. The boards were either treated in a positive way, or in the case of shows like I Love Lucy or Dennis the Menace, they were treated in joking or silly manners. There were a couple of early 20th century murderers who tried to make the claim that the board made them do it. Kind of like Son of Sam tried to say the neighbor's dog made him do it. By the way, Son of Sam later admitted he made that up about the dog, in case you didn't know. These were dismissed as untrue and poor attempts to get out of murder convictions, and I believe there were only 2 accounts of anyone trying to do this. At least I only found 2. Those couple of kooks aside, and you've always got to expect a bad apple or 2, people seemed to fall into one of 2 camps when it came to how the Ouija board was viewed. Either you just didn't believe in ghosts or the paranormal, etc., and thought that any claims of spirit communication, be they by board or what have you, were silly and easily dismissed, or you saw absolutely nothing wrong with the use of Ouija boards. So, what was the turning point? What changed? Well, it was the movie The Exorcist in 1973 that changed the Ouija board's place in American culture. In the movie, the young girl gets possessed by a demon, and this is attributed to her playing with a Ouija board. The movie was supposed to be based on a true story, but we can, and probably will, forever debate what, if any, of the events in the movie were ever true. I mean, despite people being involved in the Amityville case coming forward and saying it was a hoax and a publicity stunt inspired by the movie The Exorcist, no less, the myth of Amityville House still persists. So I don't think we can ever really get to how much of the Exorcist story was ever true. I am willing to entertain the idea that something paranormal may have happened to the person who inspired the story, but I do not believe that whatever that might have been was anything like the movie. This movie, The Exorcist, had such an effect on pop culture that we still feel its influence today, far beyond how it colored the perceptions of the Ouija board. Staying on topic, though, this movie introduced the idea that demons could come through the board and possess people, and started the ball rolling on the idea that Ouija boards are inherently evil. The power of suggestion is far more powerful than we often want to admit, and the movie planted a fantastically horrifying seed in our collective human imagination. That seed has grown into a twisted and gnarled tree whose gruesome appearance can make us completely forget the Ouija board's benign beginnings. I know that some of you are saying, but Rin, I or someone I know used a Ouija board and then had a horrible experience with a malevolent spirit. How do you explain that if Ouija boards don't conjure evil spirits? We will get to that topic. But first, let's talk about some actual published scientific research on what's actually going on when you use a Ouija board. Two doctors, now mind you, these were not medical doctors, just so we're clear, and a postdoctoral researcher decided that they wanted to find out if more than just the ideometer effect was going on when we use the Ouija board. That effect, if you're not familiar with it, was written about by French physician and physiologist Benjamin Carpenter in 1852. In layman's terms, it is the very subtle movements we make without conscious will. They found out that while it's not spirits or demons speaking to us through the Ouija board, we can definitely access information through these talking boards. Where is this information coming from? Our subconscious or unconscious. People will argue about which term is better. They found that those movements that we aren't willfully conscious of weren't completely random, but were actually purposefully spelling out information that is inside our brains, but that we don't have conscious access to. It was a Halloween party that inspired the group from the University of British Columbia Visual Cognition Lab to form and conduct these experiments. They had participants answer fact-based questions, like, what is the capital of Brazil? Now, when the participants didn't think that they knew the answer, those who answered without the Ouija board thinking that they did not know the answer got the answers right about 50% of the time, which is statistically what you would expect for subjects that are guessing. However, participants who believed that they didn't know the answer but used a Ouija board to answer the question got the correct answers upwards of 65% of the time. For those of you who aren't familiar with this sort of statistical data and aren't a complete geek like me, that number is very significant. There is one very interesting tidbit they found, though, by doing these. For this to work, for you to be able to access that information you're not conscious of, they found that the participant needed to believe that the answer was coming from somewhere other than themselves. In their experiments, the blindfolded participants tended to believe that it was the other person using the Ouija board with them. What they didn't know was that once the blindfold was on, they were actually the only one touching the planchette. Though they were the only one touching anything, many of the participants complained that the other person, who was a confederate of the experiment, had actually removed their hands once the participant was blindfolded and the experiment had begun. They would constantly claim that clearly the other person who they believed was touching the planchette was very obviously moving it. However, it was only the participant who was touching and moving the planchette. The thing is, the very nature of this effect makes us feel like the movements we are seeing resulting from the effect, like the movement of the planchette, are coming from outside of us rather than inside of us. In summation, these movements that we aren't conscious of and don't control can offer us a window into parts of our brain that we don't have conscious access to. And as unspooky and as unfun as it may be, it's really been us, and not spirits or demons, moving the planchette all along. We just aren't doing it with our conscious minds. For those of you who are academically minded, it was Dr. Rensick, Dr. Fells, and researcher Gaucho, I believe is how you pronounce her name, of the University of British Columbia who conducted these experiments, and an abstract was published in Consciousness and Cognition, Volume 21, Issue 2, June 2012, pages 976 through 982, if you would like to read the full details. They believe this information could actually have some interesting implications and even some applications to things like Alzheimer's. And they definitely had a desire to conduct further experiments, but at least everything I've read says that they were having a lot of trouble trying to get traditional research grants because none of the traditional avenues of academic research want to be associated with Ouija boards. So they had plans for further experiments. I have not been able to find any documentation that they have been able to conduct those. All right, so we've covered that for the first 75 years of the 121 that the Ouija board has been around, that it actually had a good rep and wasn't seen as a portal straight to evil. If you want to throw in the years that spirit and talking boards were being used prior to the patented Ouija board, then even more of its history is positive. We've also covered that what's mystical about the board is that it allows us to use that unconscious movement effect to access information in our unconscious, or implicit semantic memory, as they refer to it in the scientific abstract. So let's address the burning question of why then people have experiences that connect malevolent spirits and Ouija boards. Because I'm not discounting people's experiences, but when we look at Ouija boards in the light of the information I've presented to you here, we can really only draw a couple of conclusions while trying to remain somewhat scientific. I'm just going to be blunt and come right out and say it, even though there's a lot of people who aren't going to want to hear it. It's not the Ouija board. It is the person or persons using the Ouija board that is attracting the spirit activity. That doesn't make anyone bad or evil, and I'm not judging you if you've ever brought something negative through, but the piece of cardboard from the game company is just that, a lump of cardboard that isn't summoning crap. It's not the tools, it's the person using the tools. And I mean no judgment here. We've all done stuff, and sometimes stuff happens that we don't intend. So no judgment, but it's not the board, it's the person or persons using the board. Here's the real talk. Anything, and I do mean anything, can be used as a tool to summon dark shit or open a door for it to come through. If you're so minded, you could use a teddy bear to bring a malevolent spirit into your space. But notice how I said that. It's not the teddy bear bringing the dark entity through, it's the person using the teddy bear. The thing that's different between my teddy bear example and the Ouija board is that the Ouija board is tapping into our unconscious mind, which isn't always the safest place. It's where we store some really nasty stuff, and that we either can't deal with or that we have chosen to deny and repress. You've got two potential reasons here that something negative might come through when using a Ouija board. The first being someone actually wants to tempt fate and bring something dark through on purpose. The second being somebody's subconscious mind brings something dark through. Either way, don't blame the board. You may be asking then, can spirits ever use the board to communicate with the living? I mean, if it's just this unconscious muscle action that's connecting to our unconscious, can there ever actually be spirit communication involved with a spirit board? The answer to that is yes. While like tarot cards, pendulums, and other forms of scrying can, and at their base nature, do work without making contact with any spirits, they and the Ouija board can all be used to do so. Again, this is not a choice the board makes for us, but a way that we choose to use the board. You can set out with intent to use the board to allow a present spirit or a spirit you call upon to communicate with you through it. I advise great caution in doing this. Remember, the board is not in control in this situation. Ideally, you, the person using the tool, is in control. But if you don't know what you're doing, you may wind up letting less than desirable spirits become in control of the situation. Again, this is not the doing of the Ouija board, it's the person allowing the board to be used in this manner. And even experienced mediums like myself can stumble across an unpleasant spirit from time to time. Do you know how to handle such a situation? I highly recommend that if you listen to nothing else that I say in this episode, that you take this piece of sage advice to heart. Never summon what you can't banish. I have no idea who originally said that, but when it comes to those who seek out communication with spirits, it's the best advice you can heed. If you really want to communicate with spirits through any tool or by any means, I suggest you research, and if you can, get the guidance of a few people who know their butts from a hole in the ground on this topic. And even if you're like myself, who just has a natural aptitude to see and speak with spirits, and it's just sort of something that happened, it just was part of my life, I didn't seek it out, still, research, 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 and learn from the best examples you can find. I hope that everything I have said has made sense. I hope that you understand that Ouija boards in and of themselves are not evil. It's what we do with them that determines the outcome, not the boards themselves. They have no consciousness of their own. I hope that you know a little bit more about the history now and what's going on. If you guys have any questions, please, as always, feel free to hit me up with them. If there's anything that I didn't explain well enough, please let me know, because I'm hoping I'm articulating everything well enough to get my points across. That concludes the original audio, but here are some thoughts that I would like to add to this. The bottom line is that Ouija boards aren't any more a portal for evil spirits than a ordinary cardboard box that you get your Amazon orders delivered in. The boards themselves are not dangerous or evil in and of themselves. Ouija boards don't attract spirits or open a doorway to the other side. They are inanimate objects with no intrinsic power of their own. What determines the outcome of their use is the person or persons using them. It is the person using the board who determines what the outcome will be. The bottom line is that you can't blame the board for your results. It's just a mass-produced piece of cardboard. And even if you are not using the mass-produced piece of cardboard and you're perhaps using a handmade wood board that is intended for spirit communication, it is still just an inanimate object. While Ouija boards are not dangerous in and of themselves, if you haven't thoroughly researched or been trained in spirit work and how to make it as safe as possible, and you want to use a board with the express purpose of connecting with spirits, then you probably shouldn't be using the Ouija board at all until you change that situation. On the other hand, if you've spent the time studying spirit communication from various resources and perspectives and have studied and practiced the ways to do it in as safe a manner as possible, because nothing is foolproof, then the Ouija board can be a very positive and helpful tool. But again, it is just that, a tool with no will or agenda of its own. Let's put an end to the myths around Ouija boards. Remember its wholesome history and stop blaming it for those who misuse it, either intentionally or unintentionally, or those who use it and have undesired results because they didn't fully understand what they were doing. If you are going to use a Ouija board for spirit communication, make sure that A, you know what you're doing, that you've studied spirit communication and all that that entails, but also make sure to regularly cleanse the board that you're using and yourself and your space by whatever methods are appropriate for your personal spiritual path. But hopefully now you have a better understanding of the actual factual history of the Ouija board and what is actually going on when you use it according to science. And again, even if you don't want to use it in the way that they used it in the experiments and what is going on there, if you want to deliberately make it a tool for spirit communication, that can be done, absolutely, but make sure that you are taking responsibility for what you are doing, because it is the user and not the board. I hope that you've enjoyed today's episode of Paranormal AF. Thank you for listening. Please share the podcast with your friends, and I'll see you Paranormal AF spooky mother lovers in the next episode.